There's a stillness in a house too big for one person, a quiet that presses against your skin like damp air. I've lived with it for years, learned to fill it with the hum of the dishwasher, the clatter of pots, the drone of the TV I leave on just to hear voices that aren't mine. At 40, I've become a master of routine, ironing Paul's shirts even though he's gone half the time, pruning the roses he never notices, keeping the kitchen spotless as if someone's watching. It's not that our marriage is bad. It's just faded, like a photograph left too long in the sun, the colors bleeding out until you can't remember what it looked like new. Paul's a salesman, always chasing the next commission, the next handshake, leaving me to tend this life we built. A life that feels more like a museum than a home. I used to dream of more. In my 20s, I'd lie awake imagining a world beyond the cul-de-sac. Travel, art, a love that burned bright instead of smoldering. But then came Ethan, our son, and with him the mortgage, the minivan, the steady grind of domesticity. I don't regret it, not really. I love Ethan fiercely, even now that he's 19 and off at college, his room a silent shrine to the boy he was. And Paul, he's a good man, steady in his way, even if his steadiness has turned to absence. I tell myself it's enough, this quiet existence, this predictable rhythm. But some nights, when the house creaks and the shadows stretch long across the ceiling, I feel it. A hollow ache, a whisper of something missing, something I buried so deep I forgot its name. That summer, the heat came early, relentless, turning the air thick and syrupy. It was the kind of weather that made you want to peel off your skin, to stand under a cold shower until the world made sense again. I was on the porch that Tuesday, a glass of iced tea sweating in my hand, when Mark's truck rattled up the driveway. Dust swirled behind him, catching the sunlight in a gritty haze, and he stepped out, all sharp edges and easy confidence. Paul's younger brother, 32, with a mechanic's hands and a grin that cut through the stillness like a blade. His hair was dark, tousled from the wind, and his t-shirt clung to his chest, damp with sweat. "Hey Lydia," he said, his voice low, familiar, like he'd never been gone. "Paul around." I shook my head, brushing a strand of hair from my forehead, the humidity making it stick. "Chicago. Another trip. You know how it is." He nodded, unsurprised, hefting a duffel bag over his shoulder. "Yes, I do. Mind if I crash here a few days? Got some time off, figured I'd swing by." I should have said no. The words were there, perched on my tongue. The guest room's a mess, Mark, maybe another time. But they wouldn't come. The house was too quiet, too empty, and his presence, uninvited as it was, felt like a jolt to a system I hadn't realized was failing. "Sure," I said instead, forcing a smile that felt brittle. "Spare keys under the mat." He smirked, that lopsided grin I'd seen 100 times at family barbecues. But this time it landed differently, heavier. "Always is." That was how it began. Mark moving into the guest room, his boots tracking faint dirt across my hardwood floors, his laughter echoing where silence had reigned. He was 8 years younger than me, a restless spark to my steady ember, and I told myself it was nothing, just family, just Paul's kid brother crashing for a few days. But I noticed him in ways I hadn't before. The way his shoulders filled a doorway, the scar curving along his ribcage from some reckless teenage stunt, the quiet intensity in his blue eyes when he thought I wasn't looking. It was absurd, dangerous, a flicker of something I should have snuffed out the moment it started. But I didn't. I let it burn. It was the garage that changed everything. Paul's Mustang sat there like a ghost, a 1967 fastback he'd bought with grand dreams of restoration. A project to keep us young, he'd said, back when Ethan was still in diapers. It hadn't run in years. Its cherry red paint dulled to a dusty rose, tires sagging, hood propped open like a plea for attention. Mark found it the second day, poking around while I was in the kitchen slicing tomatoes, the knife slipping once as I caught his shadow through the window. "Jesus, Lyd," he called, his voice bouncing off the concrete walls. "This thing's a damn tragedy. Paul ever gonna fix it?" I stepped outside, wiping my hands on a dish towel, the heat slamming into me like a fist. "Not likely. It's been his someday since forever." He ran a hand over the fender, fingers tracing the grime, leaving streaks like veins. "Mind if I take a crack at it? Been too long since I got my hands dirty." "Go ahead," I said, shrugging. "Just don't expect it to thank you." He grinned, eyes glinting with mischief. "I'm good at coaxing things back to life." By noon, he was out there, shirtless under the blazing sun, toolbox sprawled across the floor like a surgeon's kit. I watched from the kitchen, telling myself I was just being polite, making sure he didn't dehydrate. But my gaze lingered, on the flex of his shoulders as he wrestled with a bolt, the sweat beading on his spine, the way his jeans hung low, exposing a strip of tanned skin above the waistband. The air carried the sharp bite of gasoline and hot metal, a scent that sank into me, primal and intoxicating. I pressed my fingers to the cool glass of the window, steadying myself against the pull I refused to name. "You need anything?" I asked later, stepping into the garage with a glass of lemonade, my sundress clinging to my thighs. My voice was tighter than I wanted, betraying me. He straightened, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, smearing grease across his forehead. "Nah, I'm set. This engine's a disaster, though timing belt's toast, carburetor's gunked up. Gonna be a fight." "Sounds like a lost cause," I said, handing him the glass. Our fingers brushed, a fleeting jolt that made me jerk back, the condensation slick and cold against my palm. "Maybe," he said, taking a slow sip, his throat moving as he swallowed. "But I don't give up easy." His eyes locked on mine, steady and unreadable, and my chest tightened, air catching in my lungs. I mumbled something about dinner and retreated, the screen door slamming behind me. That night, I lay awake, the ceiling fan spinning lazy circles above me, my skin prickling with a heat that wasn't just the weather. His hands moved over the engine like they could move over me, I thought, then shoved it away, horrified. He was Paul's brother. My brother-in-law. A kid, practically, compared to me. This was a fluke, a trick of loneliness, a summer fever I'd sweat out. But the image stayed, those rough, capable hands, the way they gripped a wrench like they could grip me. And sleep eluded me, leaving me raw and restless. Days bled into a strange rhythm. I'd cook sandwiches, pasta, anything to keep my hands busy. And Mark would work on the Mustang, the clank of tools and hum of the radio drifting through the house like a pulse. He'd come in for breaks, shirt slung over his shoulder, sweat glistening on his chest, and we'd talk. It started small, whether old family stories, the time Paul tried to grill steaks and nearly set the deck on fire. But then it deepened, his questions turning personal, probing. "You ever get tired of it?" He asked one afternoon, leaning against the counter as I chopped onions, tears stinging my eyes from more than the fumes. "Tired of what?" I kept my gaze on the knife, steadying my breath. "This." He waved a hand, at the kitchen, the house, me. The whole good wife thing. Holding everything together, while Paul's out there living his life. I froze, the blade hovering mid-cut. "He works hard, Mark. It's not like he's off partying. We've got a life here, a good one." "Sure," he said, but his tone was sharp, skeptical. "A life where you're alone half the time, playing housekeeper to a ghost. You deserve more than that, Lyd. You deserve to feel something." The words sliced through me, raw and unfiltered, and I laughed to mask the way my heart lurched. What, like I'm missing some big romance? "I'm 40. That ship sailed." He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell him. Sweat and motor oil, a rough, dizzying mix. "Doesn't mean you stop wanting it." My hands shook, the knife clattering to the counter. I turned away, focusing on the onions, but his presence lingered, a heat at my back I couldn't shake. He didn't push further, just grabbed a beer from the fridge and headed back to the garage, leaving me to wrestle with the echo of his words. "You deserve to feel something." I did feel something. Guilt, shame, a flicker of longing I hadn't let myself acknowledge in years. I'd been a good wife, a good mother, sanding down my edges to fit the life Paul and I built. But good wasn't the same as alive, and Mark's voice had cracked open a door I'd nailed shut long ago. I started finding excuses to go to the garage. I'd bring him water, ask dumb questions about fuel lines or spark plugs, anything to stand in that space where the air thrummed with his energy. He noticed. I saw it in the way his smiles turned knowing, the way his eyes lingered when I bent to pick up a dropped rag. The tension grew, a taut wire stretching between us, vibrating with every glance, every accidental touch. I'd catch myself staring at the curve of his jaw, the flex of his forearms, then snap my eyes away, heat flooding my cheeks. This wasn't me. I wasn't this woman, restless, reckless, teetering on the edge of something forbidden. But the more I fought it, the stronger it pulled, a tide I couldn't outrun. Thursday night was the breaking point. Paul called that afternoon, his voice tinny over a bad connection, saying he'd be gone another week. "Client's a pain in the ass," he grumbled, oblivious to the tremor in my okay. I hung up, the silence crashing over me like a wave, and wandered to the garage barefoot, my sundress sticking to my skin. Mark was under the Mustang, legs jutting out, a flashlight beam slicing through the dimness. The radio played Springsteen, Thunder Road, low and gravelly, and the air was thick with gasoline and heat, a heady brew that made my head swim. "Still at it?" I asked, leaning against the workbench, my voice unsteady. He slid out, sitting up, his chest streaked with grime, hair damp against his forehead. "Yes. Think I've got the carburetor sorted. Wanna hear her purr?" I nodded, and he turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, then roared, a deep primal sound that shook the floor and rattled my bones. He whooped, grinning wide, and I laughed, a sound that burst free from some forgotten place inside me. "Told you miracles," he said, cutting the engine and climbing out. He was close now, too close, his arm brushing mine as he reached for a rag, his skin hot against my own. "You're a mess," I said, gesturing at the grease, my voice catching in my throat. "Part of the job." He wiped his hands, but his eyes stayed on me, dark and piercing. "You're not, though. Always so damn perfect." I swallowed, heat surging through me. "I'm not perfect." "Liars." He stepped closer, and I couldn't move, pinned by the weight of his gaze. "You've got no idea how good you look, Lyd." Standing there, all soft and real in this shithole of a garage. "Mark," I started, a plea, a warning, but it died as his fingers grazed my cheek, rough and warm. My breath hitched, and I should have pulled away, should have run back to the house and locked myself in. But I didn't. I leaned into it, just enough, and that was all he needed. His hand slid to the back of my neck, pulling me in, and his lips crashed against mine. Hard, hungry, tasting of salt and raw need. I gasped, my hands clutching his shoulders, the heat of him searing through me like a brand. It wasn't soft, wasn't tentative. It was a dam breaking, a fire roaring free after years of being banked. His tongue traced mine, his grip tightening, and I pressed myself closer, the workbench digging into my hip as we stumbled against it. The world shrank to this. The rasp of his stubble, the thud of my pulse, the way his hands roamed with a desperation that mirrored my own. I was drowning in him, in the scent of oil and sweat, in the reckless, beautiful wrongness of it all. Then the phone rang. Paul's ringtone shrilled through the haze, and I jerked back, chest heaving, lips swollen. Mark froze, eyes wild, breath ragged. I fumbled for the phone on the workbench, hands trembling as I answered. "Hey honey," Paul said, cheerful, oblivious. "Just checking in. How's everything?" "Fine," I croaked, my voice alien thin. "Everything's fine." Mark watched me, silent, his chest rising and falling as Paul prattled about some dinner meeting. I nodded along, barely hearing, my skin still tingling where Mark's hands had been. When I hung up, the garage was quiet again, the radio's hum a faint pulse beneath the tension coiling between us. "I should go," I said, stepping back, legs shaky. "Lydia," he began, voice rough, but I shook my head, fleeing to the house before he could finish. I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, sheets twisted around me, the ceiling fan whirring uselessly above. The kiss replayed in my mind, his lips, his hands, the way my body had arched toward him without permission. Guilt clawed at me, sharp and relentless, a beast gnawing at my ribs. Paul's voice echoed in my ears, steady, trusting, the husband I'd vowed to love through sickness and health, through absence and silence. I'd betrayed him in that garage, crossed a line I couldn't uncross. But beneath the guilt was something else. Something alive, wild, unrepentant. For the first time in years, I'd felt wanted, seen, not as a wife or a mother or a keeper of routines, but as a woman, raw and real. And I craved it, God help me, I craved it like air. Morning came, gray and heavy, the sky threatening rain. Mark was in the garage again, the Mustang's hood up, his movements precise, focused. I stayed inside, scrubbing counters that didn't need scrubbing, folding towels already neat, trying to drown the ache in my chest with busy work. But my mind wouldn't quiet. I saw Paul's face, his tired smile, the lines etched around his eyes from years on the road, and then Mark's, younger, sharper, burning with something Paul hadn't given me in a decade. I hated myself for the comparison, for the way my pulse quickened at the memory of Mark's touch. I was a good wife. I'd always been a good wife. So why did this feel like waking up? By afternoon, I couldn't fight it anymore. I stood at the garage door, watching him, the air thick with yesterday's ghost. He was bent over the engine, a wrench in hand, his shirt soaked through with sweat. The radio played low, some bluesy tune that matched the storm brewing outside. He looked up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You okay?" "No," I admitted, voice barely audible. "Are you?" He shrugged, a half-smile tugging at his lips. "Not really." I stepped inside, the concrete cool against my bare feet, the smell of oil and metal wrapping around me like a shroud. We can't do this, Mark. Paul, he's your brother. My husband. I know. His voice was rough, strained, his eyes searching mine. But tell me you don't feel it too, and I'll stop. I'll pack up and go. I opened my mouth to lie, to say I didn't, to send him away and bury this madness before it consumed me. But the words stuck, choked by the truth surging beneath my skin. I did feel it. Every glance, every touch, every second of that kiss had carved itself into me, a scar I couldn't hide. I crossed the space between us. Slow, deliberate, my heart hammering so loud I thought it might crack my ribs. This is a mistake, I said, my hand finding his chest, the heat of him pulsing through his shirt. Then we're both fucked, he murmured and pulled me in. This time there was no phone, no interruption, just us and the fire we'd unleashed. His hands were everywhere, my waist, my hips, sliding under my dress with a hunger that matched my own. I kissed him back, fierce and unyielding, the garage spinning as we stumbled against the Mustang, its metal warm against my back. His breath was hot on my neck, his fingers digging into my skin, and I let go. Let the guilt, the fear, the years of restraint burn away in the heat of him. It was reckless, wrong, a betrayal of everything I'd promised. But it was alive, and I was alive with it, my body singing under his touch. When it was over, we collapsed onto the concrete floor, backs against the car, the silence heavy with the weight of what we'd done. My dress was crumpled, my hair a tangle, and Mark's shirt lay crumpled across the room. Rain pattered against the roof, a soft counterpoint to the storm still raging inside me. I stared at the ceiling, guilt seeping in like damp rot, but his hand found mine, rough and steady, grounding me. What now? He asked, voice low, uncertain. I don't know, I said, and it was the truth. Paul would be home soon, days, maybe a week, and this would have to end. I'd have to face him, smile through the lies, pretend my hands hadn't just traced his brother's skin. But as I sat there, Mark's fingers laced with mine, the engine's faint ticking a heartbeat in the air, I felt something shift. Something had woken up inside me, something wild and unapologetic, something I wasn't sure I could cage again. The rain stopped that night, leaving the world slick and quiet. I stood at the kitchen sink, washing dishes I'd already cleaned, my reflection staring back from the window. Pale, tired, a stranger with flushed cheeks and haunted eyes. Mark was in the garage, the light spilling out into the yard, and I wondered what he was thinking, if he felt the same clawing guilt, the same desperate pull. I'd always been the steady one, the rock Paul leaned on, the mother Ethan needed. But steady didn't mean whole, and this reckless, beautiful mess, had cracked me open, exposing a hunger I'd buried under years of duty. I thought of Paul, of the man I'd married 20 years ago, laughing over cheap wine in a cramped apartment, dreaming of a future we'd only half achieved. I loved him still, in a quiet, faded way, but it wasn't the love of novels or movies. It was habit, comfort, a worn path I'd walked so long I forgot there were others. Mark was a detour, a dangerous curve I shouldn't have taken, but now that I had, I couldn't unsee the view. I pressed my hands to the sink's edge, water dripping from my fingers, and let the tears come, silent, hot, a release I hadn't known I needed. The next day, Mark was quieter, his usual bravado muted as he worked on the Mustang. I stayed inside, avoiding him, but the pull was relentless. By evening, I found myself at the garage again, the sky bruising purple with dusk. He was tightening something under the hood, his movements slow, deliberate, and I watched him, my chest tight with a mix of dread and desire. We need to talk, I said, stepping inside, my voice trembling. He straightened, wiping his hands, his eyes meeting mine with a weariness I hadn't seen before. Yes, we do. I crossed my arms, hugging myself against the truth I didn't want to face. Paul's coming home soon. It can't happen again. He nodded slow, like he'd expected it. I know. Doesn't mean I want it to stop. Mark, my voice cracked, and I looked away, the concrete blurring through tears. I'm married. You're his brother. This isn't some fling we can laugh off. It's wrong. Then why does it feel so fucking right? He said, stepping closer, his voice raw. Tell me you don't feel it, Lydia. Tell me last night didn't mean anything. It meant everything, I whispered, the admission tearing free before I could stop it. That's why it's killing me. He reached for me, his hand hovering, then dropping. I'm not sorry. I should be, but I'm not. I laughed, a broken sound. I am. And I'm not. And that's the worst part. We stood there, the space between us a battlefield of want and shame, the Mustang looming like a witness to our fall. I wanted to touch him, to feel that fire again, but I saw Paul's face, his trust, his oblivious love, and it anchored me, heavy and unyielding. I need to figure this out, I said finally, stepping back. Alone. He nodded, jaw tight. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere. Not yet. I fled to the house, locking myself in the bedroom, the walls closing in as I sank to the floor. My mind spun, Paul's voice, Mark's touch, the woman I'd been and the one I was becoming. I'd spent years building a life, a family, a shield against the chaos of wanting more. But Mark had torn through it, exposing the cracks, the hunger, the parts of me I'd locked away. I hated him for it, and I craved him for it, and the push-pull of it left me breathless, lost. Days passed, a blur of avoidance and ache. Mark stayed in the garage, I stayed inside, the distance a fragile truce. Paul called again, saying he'd be home Monday, and each tick of the clock felt like a countdown to his return, to the end of this fever dream, to the moment I'd have to choose. I cooked, cleaned, stared at the roses wilting in the heat, my hands itching to run to Mark, my heart screaming to stay. I was a good wife, I'd always been a good wife. But good wasn't enough anymore, and that truth gnawed at me, relentless. Sunday night, the air was thick with the promise of rain. I stood at the back door, watching Mark in the garage, the light casting shadows across his face. He was beautiful in a rough, untamed way, and I hated how much I wanted him, how much I'd always want him, even after this ended. I stepped outside, drawn by a force I couldn't name, and he looked up as I entered, his eyes dark with something unspoken. Tomorrow, I said, voice shaking. Paul's back tomorrow. I know. He set down his wrench, stepping closer, the air between us electric. What do you want, Lydia? Right now, not tomorrow. What do you want? I swallowed, tears burning my eyes. I want you. And I hate myself for it. He closed the gap, his hand cupping my face, thumb brushing my cheek. Then hate me too. But don't walk away. I kissed him, soft at first, then desperate, pouring every ounce of my confusion, my guilt, my need into it. His arms wrapped around me, strong and steady, and for a moment the world was just us. The garage, the Mustang, the rain starting to fall outside. It wasn't an answer, wasn't a solution, but it was real, and I clung to it, knowing it couldn't last. When we pulled apart, breathless, he rested his forehead against mine. What now? I don't know, I said, and it was still the truth. Paul would be home in hours, and I'd have to face him, smile through the lies, bury this fire before it burned everything down. But as Mark held me, the rain drumming a steady beat, I felt the woman I'd buried clawing her way free. Wild, unapologetic, alive. I could still turn back, still be the wife Paul expected, the mother Ethan deserved. But as Mark's breath warmed my skin, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The summer stretched ahead, a road with no end in sight, and I stood at its edge, teetering. One step and I'd fall into Mark, into this forbidden heat, into a life I didn't recognize. Or I could stay, safe and steady, the Lydia I'd always been. The choice was mine, and it terrified me, because for the first time in years, I didn't know which way I'd go.